Good evening to folks as you do join. I'm David Eichenthal. I'm on the board of the Tennessee Democracy Forum, and we're very, very excited to have folks join us this evening for what is the fourth of our conversations on democracy. The Tennessee Democracy Forum is a project of Forward Tennessee, and we are very focused on building a pro-democracy movement here in the great state of Tennessee. Earlier this year, we conducted the first annual Tennessee Democracy Survey, and what we found was that Tennesseans are divided. So about half of Tennessee voters believe that Joe Biden was elected president of the United States in 2020, and about half don't. About half of Tennesseans believe that January 6th was an insurrection, and about half believe that it was a normal form of political protest. So what we at the Tennessee Democracy Forum have focused on for the last several months is trying to have a conversation about democracy in the state of Tennessee, and both by talking about where there is disagreement on basic issues around democracy, but also talking about those issues where there is a consensus. So the ground rules for this evening are pretty simple. I'm going to be chatting with our guest for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. As folks have questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I would encourage folks that if you've got questions as we're talking, please feel free to hit that button and add your question. I'll do my best to integrate questions from the audience to the conversation that we're having. And if I can't get to all of those questions, I'll certainly leave time at the end this evening to try and get to those that remain. So with that, let me introduce our guest this evening. Robert Shrum has spent a career as a speechwriter, as a strategist, and as a political consultant. He has worked on literally dozens of campaigns, from the local level to candidates for president to even international campaigns for elected officials running abroad. He is now the director for the Center for the Political Future and the Carmen and Lewis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics at USC, where he teaches on domestic policy, applied politics, and elections. He is a member of the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. We are now a little less than 2 months away from what appear to be rather consequential midterm elections. We are just a few weeks after a presidential speech on democracy. I really can't think of any better guest for this conversation on democracy than Bob Shrum. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, David, thank you. I'm happy to be here and I admire the work you're doing.
Thank you. Bob, I want to start by sort of letting you introduce yourself, if you will, to folks who are joining us this evening. Can I ask you to take a few minutes and talk about where all of this started for you, how you became involved in politics, how you became involved in government? I think we've talked about this. I think I've read some of this, but it's kind of a great story worth hearing.
Well, I always loved politics, even when I was a kid. I'm so old that I was able to ask my parents if I could stay home from, I think it was first or second grade, and listen to Douglas MacArthur's speech to Congress, Old Soldiers Never Die, after Truman fired him. I volunteered for Adlai Stevenson in 1952. And when I went into the headquarters, they looked at me because I was a kid and they said, you can't go door to door. And what are you going to do? I said, well, maybe I could work on the phones. And so they talked to me for a while. They said, we think you could. So I had to get used to people saying, yes, ma'am, because my voice hadn't changed yet. And that's what people at the other end of the line thought. I was lucky enough that the Democratic Convention in 1960 was in Los Angeles. I managed things were much more porous then. You know, I managed to get a job working for Pierre Salinger. I wasn't paid, of course, although they did eventually give me meal money. And one of my jobs was to take people up to John F. Kennedy's suite in the Biltmore. They'd show up in the press office. I'd take them up, and that's how I met President Kennedy briefly. But the one thing I'll say is, when he opened the door, he not only filled the room, he filled the hallway. I mean, he had an extraordinary presence. After I got out of law school, I had a very close friend named Larry Tribe, who is one of the leading constitutional professors or constitutional scholars in the history of the country. And he said to me, because I was coaching debate at Boston College, and he said, you can't do this indefinitely. What do you want to do? And I told him. And he wrote a couple of letters. I got interviewed by Mayor John Lindsay's team in New York, and by Jeff Greenfield, who was his speechwriter, who was leaving. And they said, write a practice speech. I went back to my hotel and wrote a speech and brought it back. And they said, we thought you were going to mail this in. I said, well, I just did it. And I got hired about 2 hours later. I worked for George McGovern in 1972. I always say that, you know, we lost 49 states. We were kind of a children's crusade, except for Frank Mankiewicz. But at least we might not have gone to the White House, but at least we didn't go to jail. I admired McGovern for the truths he told during that campaign. I remember at one point our pollster came out and said, stop talking about Watergate, people don't care. And he said, Pat, I have to talk about Watergate. This is real. It's a threat to American democracy. And so he kept talking about Watergate. He kept talking about Vietnam, even when people told him not to. I worked briefly for Jimmy Carter, left and went to work for a magazine called New Times that won the National Magazine Award one year, but doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, was closed the year it won the National Magazine Award. Went to work for Ted Kennedy in 1979. Wrote speeches, became his press secretary afterwards. In late '84, I decided I wanted to go out and start a political consulting firm. He called me, and he was very supportive, and he called me and he said, you don't have any clients, do you? And I said, no, not yet. He said, well, you do now, because I'm going to be your client for the next 6 months. He didn't need me for anything at that point, except I always was, you know, he always expected that I would help him with speeches. So for the 6 months that we were getting started, I had some income because I was quote unquote consulting with him. And then we went on and we worked in a raft of Senate campaigns, gubernatorial campaigns. By late 1988, we were working for the British Labour Party, which I remained associated with a couple of interruptions all the way up to 2007, and still helped out on a volunteer basis after that until 2010. We did other campaigns overseas. We did the Gore campaign. I always say that Al Gore was elected and not inaugurated, but I want to draw a big distinction between that and what Donald Trump has done and said. When the Supreme Court decision came down, I think Al Gore believed he had won the election, but he also believed that you had to observe certain democratic norms for the sake of the system, and he conceded. So it's a very different thing than the argument Trump has tried to make. Did it again with my friend John Kerry in 2004. We lost by, he came closer to defeating an incumbent president in time of war, renominated by his own party, than any candidate in American history. We just needed to switch about half a football stadium's worth of votes in Ohio. And after that, I went off and I taught at NYU for 8 years. Then was offered this endowed chair, then was asked to create the Center for the Political Future at USC. So I guess I've been very, very lucky in my life. I've made a living, a pretty good living actually, doing what I love. And I think you couldn't promise anybody anything much more than that.
Thank you. That's great. Let me turn to your expertise in one of the many areas that you talked about, which is political speeches. President Biden gave a speech a couple of weeks ago about democracy. I remember other American presidents in my lifetime giving speeches about democracy, but it was usually about the fight for democracy abroad. I don't remember an American president having to come forward and give a speech about the need to fight for democracy at home that much. Tell me, what did you think of the president's speech? What did he get right? What did he get wrong?
I thought he was largely right. He was honest and truthful about what he thought. I've seen some polling data that says somewhere around 58% of the country agrees with him that our democracy is under threat. And I believe that he decided that it was time to go out and say this, that he had to warn the country. One thing about Joe Biden is very interesting. I think he may be a little bit like Harry Truman, vastly underappreciated. I mean, although his poll ratings in some polls are now back up, into 47, 48% approval, but they were down in the 38%. And at the same time, if you look at his record over the last year and a half, he has been more successful legislatively, I think, on more fronts than any president since Lyndon Johnson. But he's not charismatic in the conventional sense. He's Joe, and he talks to us like Joe. He was actually a very eloquent speaker in the 1980s when he first tried to run for president. And I think what's happened, I don't know this, but I think what's happened is he's much more careful now as he's giving a speech because his childhood stutter has reasserted itself. And the last thing he wants to do is stutter in the middle of a speech. He had beaten that by the 1980s and 1990s, but it's different now. I thought some of the commentary about the speech was ridiculous. I mean, Breonna Keeler on CNN was complaining about the 2 Marine guards standing in the back. Hasn't she watched any other presidential speeches where there are Marine guards standing behind the president? How about Trump giving his acceptance speech where the Marines opened the door? It is, I had a correspondence with a journalist, a very famous journalist yesterday. And I said, my conclusion to a lot of this is, and it's not their fault necessarily because they're habituated to a certain way of being, that the media don't know how to deal with the post-truth age. So they got to find something wrong with both sides. And obviously there are things that are wrong and mistakes that Biden has made. Afghanistan, he credited the intelligence community's estimates when he shouldn't have, when he should have been much more skeptical. Because they were telling him, don't worry, the Afghan government will survive for months, maybe even a year, maybe even more than that. And obviously that didn't turn out to be true. So you can find things to criticize. You can find places where he's waited too long. I found one today. The inflation report came out. Inflation ticked down a bit, but not to the extent people were expecting. So the headlines will be, we still have this inflation problem. And the White House was a little too overconfident. So they scheduled for today a celebration of the Inflation Reduction Act. The timing probably wasn't perfect.
Well, I want to go back to some of what you pointed out, I guess, as some of the criticism around the democracy speech. And right, I think some people said that it was too political for a presidential speech. And was this a presidential speech that was about uniting the country around democracy, or was it a midterm speech? And I guess the other question, right, is can you ever really distinguish when a president is speaking between what's political and what's governmental?
Listen, pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat. I don't want to be cynical about this, but every president giving any kind of speech, a presidential speech, is going to think about the political consequences. I mean, there can be exceptions. FDR's address to Congress after Pearl Harbor. I mean, he wasn't thinking about the next midterm election. JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world seemed to face an existential moment when we might not survive. The midterm election was like 3 or 4 weeks away. I don't think he was thinking about that. He was thinking about how to get through the greatest crisis up to that point, and maybe ever, in the history of the world. But with those kind of rare exceptions, I think presidents, obviously, they're politicians. They calculate the political consequences of what they're doing and saying.
So one of the questions, right, and I think you alluded to this when you talked about some of the polling numbers, is, what was he really trying to accomplish with this speech? And the president said it was sort of a, the kind of call to action, right, that you sometimes do when you're writing a speech or giving a speech. The president said, "I'm asking our nation to come together, unite behind the single purpose of defending our democracy, regardless of your ideology."
Well, if you're president of the United States and you believe in democracy, which I would say almost all presidents have. I don't think I have to be explicit about the exception. And if you believe in democracy, then if you think it's under threat, you're obligated to get up and talk about it and to ask people to unite in standing up for it and defending it. This is the real Joe Biden. This is why he ran for president. He talked about, when he announced for president, fighting for the soul of the nation. And he was still talking about it in that speech the other night. So I think he feels this genuinely, he feels it deeply. I'm sure they talked about the political consequences of doing this. And they decided that they had to go forward, that the stakes were too high not to do this.
It does sort of raise the question, right? And in some ways, it's sort of the question for a lot of the folks who are joining this conversation, have joined past conversations, and that we're really trying to work through on the ground in Tennessee, which is, what do you do as an individual to defend democracy, right? To the extent that it was a great call to action around democracy. It was so focused on what the threats were, and the president clearly sort of laid out the case of why democracy was at risk, but he really didn't sort of give specifics on what individuals could do to deal with this threat. I mean, I think, he's encouraged people to vote. That's obviously part of it. But, as you think about this, right, from the work that you're doing now at USC and looking back on your whole career. What's the answer to that question? Call to action to do what?
Well, first of all, I don't think he should have been telling people in that speech to write postcards
Right.
to voters. I mean, I don't think that's what the president should be doing. But I would say write postcards to voters. And if you live in a place in Tennessee where you think you can't make a difference, you can make a difference in places in Florida, in California, in some of the congressional districts in New York, in Illinois, in places where the control of the House is really going to be decided. You can do it by getting involved, by contributing, by writing postcards. And that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, and this goes more to the work that you're doing in your state, you have to talk to people. And one thing that's often misunderstood is that the first part of talking is listening. So you have to listen to people and listen to people you disagree with and try to have reasonable conversations. And yeah, a lot of the time it's not going to work. But some of the time you're actually going to begin to make some progress. I mean, one of the missions, in fact, the central mission of the Center for the Political Future at USC, aside from what we do with students, is to advance a kind of dialogue where we respect each other and we respect the truth. And I have supporters and contributors who were strongly for Donald Trump. One of them has become a friend. And we just kind of agree not to argue about it at dinner. And we have fellows who come in and interact and work with students. And, you know, one of them right now, Elon Carr, was Donald Trump's ambassador, global ambassador to combat anti-Semitism. And when you sit and talk with him, you might disagree with him on a lot of issues, but he's a perfectly reasonable person. We got to get back to that kind of dialogue. I was on a program earlier today that I was moderating for the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. And former Senator Simpson of Wyoming was on, a Republican who told the story that when he got elected to the Senate, his father had been a senator before him. He said, you got to go meet that young guy, Kennedy. You're going to disagree with him a lot, but you can also find places where you can work with him. And he was bemoaning the fact that in Wyoming now, he said, you know, you got these people and they write these platforms, and I don't agree with half the stuff in the platforms. He said, I told the guy, I said, I never read the platform. I just got to the Senate and did what I thought was right and tried to find ways to work with people. So you got to try to build those bridges. I'm under no illusions that's going to happen very quickly. I think it's going to be the work of hopefully a decade and not a generation. And in the meantime, hopefully, we'll save the democracy from some of the threats that it faces. But there's a lot that people can do as individuals. If you just walk away and you give up, then I think we're going to be in terrible trouble as the years unfold.
Yeah, it's interesting. We tried to get to this, and I'll actually ask you a little bit about some of the economic issues and how they play out in the context of kind of a pro-democracy movement. One of the great things we were able to do with our last guest for a conversation on democracy was we actually brought together a bunch of community development folks from around Tennessee, with the notion that part of the skepticism in some places around democracy is it really hasn't done a good job of delivering results. And part of what those folks from these CDFIs realized was, yeah, part of our job is being advocates for democracy as well, and that almost in everything everyone does, they could be an advocate for democracy. But I really want to turn to your story about Senator Simpson and you know, the president talked about sort of this distinction between MAGA Republicans and mainstream Republicans in his speech, right? And
Right.
actually, the president has had a pretty good run of late of actually being able to move some legislation with bipartisan support, right? I don't know that anybody necessarily expected that you'd get the gun violence reduction bill that made its way through the Senate. I think the CHIPS bill made its way through. The infrastructure bill made its way through, all getting needed Republican votes. But Bob, I really want to talk to you about the experience that you had in working with Senator Kennedy and sort of this notion of bipartisanship, right? I mean, I grew up, looking at Ted Kennedy as this great liberal icon, but in reality, right, he was both a great liberal icon, but always looking for ways to work with colleagues from across the aisle. How did he sort of square that circle, if you will, in terms of both being clear about his own beliefs and ideology, but working with others?
Before I get to that, let me say two quick things. First, the bills you mentioned were much more bipartisan for the most part in the Senate than in the House. You still have Republicans in the Senate. They're not, for the most part, going to criticize Donald Trump, but they're going to go their own way. And Donald Trump obviously is very unhappy with Mitch McConnell, probably as unhappy as a lot of Democrats are. Secondly, this economic issue you talked about is really critical. I think in 2016 that Trump won those Rust Belt areas that made the difference because he won the message war. He told people, your life has been hollowed out, your economic life has been hollowed out by foreign trade and immigration. And I'm going to solve both of those problems. And Hillary Clinton was saying, Trump's a bum. I mean, that was basically her argument. Stronger Together was her slogan, but it was more about him and how he was divisive and the kind of character he had than it was about her and what she wanted to do. Now, Biden did a little better with working class, blue collar voters in 2020 than Clinton had done. And the model for this, I think, and it applies to Tennessee in a way, is JFK thought he was going to lose the West Virginia primary in 1960 because, he'd gone in and he thought he had a 20-point lead. Then they found out he was a Catholic and he was 20 points behind. He decided to take the issue on directly, but he still thought he was going to lose. He was back in Washington and the night he won the primary. And that afternoon, he said to Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter and more than speechwriter, actually, advisor, and said to him, I've never seen anything like what I've seen in West Virginia. People should not live that way. And I know I'm not going to win this primary, but by God, if I get to the White House, I'm going to do something to help those people. And one of the first things he did as president was called the Area Redevelopment Act, which invested in places like West Virginia and Appalachia. And people there believe that this very wealthy person who, with this Harvard Boston accent, actually really cared about them. And West Virginia was, for about 40 years, almost always a Democratic state. Now it's become very much the other way. So I think Democrats need to get back, and you're not going to get immediate returns from this, but because right now Democrats are relying on women, on the suburbs, on younger people, on minorities, but Democrats can make gains with these voters who used to be traditionally Democratic, but they've got to give people a sense that they care. That brings me to your question about Ted Kennedy. I think if you looked at his elections, most of the people in Massachusetts had no doubt that he cared, and that he cared about ordinary, hardworking, middle class and working class folks. And I think he once said that if the Democratic Party didn't stand up for them, what did it stand for? So he had a very core set of principles that he believed very strongly in. But he also had the sense that you had to get results. And if you couldn't get everything you wanted right away, then you could go back the next time and the next time. So one of the last, in fact, it may be the last thing that he ever wrote, was a cover story for Newsweek when it was a real magazine. In the summer of 2009, I collaborated with him on it, and he insisted that I be credited as having collaborated with him. And it was an argument to, not explicitly to them, but it was to them. It was an argument to liberals and progressives that, you weren't going to get single payer healthcare. It wasn't going to happen. You probably weren't even going to get a public option. You could try it. But if you could get something like the Affordable Care Act, which became known as Obamacare, it was really critical to accept it, because then you could go back in other years and you could seek to improve it and to make it better. And by the way, that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act. It does a number of things that folks would have liked to do in the Affordable Care Act, including on prescription drugs. But, he could do with an Orrin Hatch, he could say after the failure of Clinton's healthcare plan, Orrin Hatch, conservative from Utah, he could say, Orrin, we really ought to do something about poor kids who have no health care. It's not their fault. They're just out there and they don't have any health care and they get sick, and a lot of them just don't get treated and die. And Hatch said, well, I agree with the principle, but I don't want this to be an entitlement. And so he and Kennedy worked it out so that it became a federally financed program administered by the states. And so 8-9 million kids suddenly got health coverage. For him, that was a win. He was not as interested in posturing as he was in making progress. And he was called the liberal lion of the Senate, and he was, I think. And he laid down a lot of markers that were very important to defining what the Democratic Party is or should be all about. But he was also all about getting things done. He legislatively, he probably changed the country to a greater degree than a lot of presidents have.
I guess one I really want to turn to, by the way, Bob, because I knew we had talked about it, I advertised you were going to talk about the Area Redevelopment Act. So thank you for.
I didn't know I was, but when you brought up that economic point, I thought it was very important to point that out.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to stick on bipartisanship. I mean, is the infrastructure bill, CHIPS, and the gun bill, is that, and taking your point, right, that there was a lot more bipartisanship in the Senate on those issues, do you see those as sort of the exceptions for the Biden presidency, or is this, potentially part of a more results-oriented approach that we could see over the next couple of years? And I guess part of it, right, depends on what happens in the midterms.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I was also going to say that Biden is clearly interested in getting results, and is by temperament and conviction someone who believes that you ought to try to work with the other side to get those results. He was heavily criticized, especially by the left during the early primaries or in the run-up to the primaries, when he said, look, I worked with people I totally disagreed with on most issues, and we made some progress. And it was almost as if people were saying, no, you have to have a litmus test or a purity test. I don't think Biden believes in that at all. Look, the devil for a lot of Democrats, especially so-called progressives, by the way, footnote, Biden's a progressive. I think I'm a progressive. Somehow or other the term has been appropriated for just a slice of the Democratic Party, when I think the Democratic Party as a whole is progressive. But Joe Manchin's a moderate, or center right, whatever you want to say. But he's a Democrat. I mean, the Republicans have talked to him about switching parties. He's so far had no interest whatsoever. And he became the villain. And then suddenly, after Mitch McConnell let the CHIPS Act go through and thought that Build Back Better was dead, along came the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a slimmed down version of Build Back Better. Didn't do everything. By the way, I hated the title Build Back Better, but it didn't do everything that Build Back Better did, but it did a huge amount. It's the biggest energy climate legislation ever passed in the history of this country. And Joe Manchin from West Virginia helped do it. And you know, one of the places where they're going to put one of the first factories under the CHIPS Act, West Virginia. And they're going to train people for those jobs so that they have a future. So, you know, you can't just write people off. I mean, you know, people were tweeting out, gee, they ought to throw Manchin, you know, out of his chairmanship of the Energy Committee. And I tweeted back, are you aware that if that happens and he switches parties, Mitch McConnell controls the Senate and no judges get confirmed? People have to be practical. I mean, I know that we live in an age of instant satisfaction. We live in an age when we think tweet is a speech, but you have to have some sense of perspective, and you have to pause before you tweet. You have to pause before you come to a conclusion, and you have to be open to the possibility that things are going to work out differently. I think the only people who had any idea that things were going to work out differently, besides Manchin, were Chuck Schumer, who's built a real relationship with him, and Joe Biden. I think that was it. And Biden very carefully kept the White House out of the negotiations and let Schumer do the negotiations. So I you know, you're not going to get anything done if you're not willing to compromise, to come. I don't necessarily think come to the middle, but if you're not willing to say, okay, I hear you, I understand, Orrin Hatch, you don't want it to be a federal entitlement. Here's another way we can do it. And then it gets done. And you know what? The 8 or 9 million kids who suddenly get to see a doctor have no idea what an entitlement is. They don't care. They just care that it happens.
It wasn't something I was going to ask you about, but how would you? So I've known Senator Schumer for most of my life. I remember Chuck when he was the youngest elected state assemblyman in New York State.
Holding a press conference every Sunday because he knew Sunday was a slow news day.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there. How would you rate him as a majority leader?
Well, right now, I think, you know, he took a lot of criticism too. I think right now you'd have to say he's doing a very effective job. He didn't give up on climate, on the Affordable Care Act fixes, on prescription drugs. He knew he wasn't going to get everything he wanted. He knew he wasn't, for example, going to get the child care tax credit right now, but he kept at it. And in a Washington which leaks like Hoover Dam, no one even knew, except probably the president, that Schumer and Manchin were having these conversations. Mitch McConnell didn't know. He was angry, felt he had been somehow or other betrayed because he'd let some of this other legislation go through on the assumption, as I said earlier, that that what's in the Inflation Reduction Act was dead.
And I think, right, there are at least published reports, and it's sort of, from my perspective, somewhat interesting in terms of the drive toward bipartisanship. Obviously, you've got to have Republicans willing to do it, but I think Senator Hickenlooper played a role with Manchin as well. Senator Murphy, I don't think anyone expected the results of the negotiations around gun violence reduction, right. they pulled that off. It's sort of, I don't know. When we had Bill Kristol on, it was right after the gun bill started to move, and it was, gee, could you get anything else? And now they're starting to get a few things. But I do want to turn back to sort of these economically challenged or forgotten places. You know, Bob, I guess you grew up in California, but you were born in your roots are Western PA roots. Am I right about that?
Yes, in a little town called Connellsville, which used to be the Coke capital of the world, the good Coke capital of the world. And you know, it's this. We left when I was a child, but and moved to California. My family had lived. My father's family had lived in Western Pennsylvania for 200 years, almost 200 years. But he thought that there was more opportunity in California, especially for his two children. And so we piled in a 1948 Chevy, and he drove us across the country for me, to a new world and a new life. But my stepson, Michael, took me back on a route trip to Connellsville, and it's hollowed out. My grandfather, my mother's father, represented it as a New Deal Democrat in the Pennsylvania state legislature in the 30s and the early 40s. And it's now a solidly red area. If you drive around, and you know, it's depopulated. I mean, there are far fewer people living there than when we left. But if you look at people's front yards, there are Trump signs. There are probably, I haven't been back, don't want to go back, probably steal the election signs. The election was stolen. The 10 Commandments posted in every front yard, as if somehow or other, if you were a liberal or progressive Democrat, you didn't believe in God, you were godless, which is the new argument that we're seeing. Actually, it's a retread of an old argument. And there were signs about guns everywhere. The downtown was hollowed out. What used to be the movie theater I used to go to when I was a little kid is now basically a secondhand store. My grandmother's house, my father's mother's house, had just been knocked down to widen a highway because nobody wanted to live there or buy it. And my grandfather, who had this wonderful house on the river, that house is just gone. So those folks feel left out, left behind. No one listens to them in their view. And then Donald Trump comes along and says, I am your voice. Now, the truth is, I think it's inarguable. The Trump administration did very little for those people economically. The tax cut did nothing for them, but he expressed their frustrations, their sense of grievance. He became an outlet. And we often, you know, there's a kind of economic determinism that some people have about politics, where they think, well, it's the economy. That's all. The economy's stupid. That's all that matters. Well, sometimes it's true, and sometimes people have other things they care more about. I think you have folks who are discombobulated by the changes in American society, the demographic changes, the fact that we're becoming a majority non-white, who feel economically threatened, who've seen their standard of living go down. And at the same time, you have an element of people who are frankly racist and anti-Semitic. And it's a pretty combustible mix. So, you know, I think that the way forward here for Biden and for folks who want to do something about this is to take some of this legislation, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and make sure that companies invest in those places and that they don't just bring in workers from outside. They hire folks for those jobs and they train them to do those jobs. They're not that complicated. People can learn to do them and they pay well.
So we've got a bunch of good questions in the Q&A that I'm going to turn to, but I want to take your comments and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you some questions about what we're going to see in the midterms, right? And let me start back in Pennsylvania. You know, we talked about this before we joined everybody else in the conversation. So President Trump is going to Pennsylvania on Friday to campaign for the Republican candidate for governor there. And to your point about Democrats speaking to these sort of forgotten places, John Fetterman in his primary actually ran an ad called Forgotten Places, talks about going to every county in Pennsylvania. Seems to me to be sort of a different kind of Democrat with a different message than some of what we've seen certainly at the national level. Same thing right in Ohio, where Tim Ryan's running against J.D. Vance, who wrote the Hillbilly Elegy. By the way, President Trump, I think it was reported today, is going to Youngstown on Saturday to campaign for J.D. Vance. Let me put your political consultant, political strategist hat on for a moment here. What do you think is going to happen in Pennsylvania? What's going to happen with Fetterman and Ryan? And I guess, what do those elections mean about for the future of democracy?
Well, first of all, I think that it's intriguing that the president, or the former president, the TFG, the former guy, is going to Pennsylvania for the gubernatorial candidate. And it looks like, we don't know for sure, Dr. Oz, the Senate candidate that Trump endorsed, is not going to show up right now. And by the way, John, you're right about John Fetterman. He's taken a leaf from Howard Dean's 50-state strategy, and he said every vote counts, every county counts. And I think that's had an impact with voters. There's a poll out today showing him 21 points ahead. I think that's probably too big. But Dr. Oz has run a Hall of Fame bad campaign. I mean, you know, you said I was from Connellsville originally. People don't talk about crudités in Connellsville. And he made that absolutely stupid video trying to talk about inflation, walking through a grocery store, saying, well, I put this together and this together because I want a crudité platter. And this is going to run me, I don't know what he said, $18 even before I add the tequila. By the way, who drinks tequila with the crudités? That's another question. And Fetterman comes back and says, see this? This is a vegetable platter. It costs $5.29. Then Oz, I mean, he just keeps doing it. He said, well, you know, I grew up right south of Philadelphia. Well, actually, if you go straight south of Philadelphia, you're in New Jersey, so where Oz has this huge mansion. So Fetterman put out immediately a response showing if you went straight south, you were in New Jersey. I have always believed that if a candidate makes a cultural connection with voters, that candidate is very difficult to beat. Barbara Mikulski, the former senator from Maryland, is a classic case of this. I mean, when we were doing her campaign, I walked around Baltimore, when we got rained out, we were going to get some lunch and postpone the shoot to the next day. And I noticed everybody was looking at her and saying, hey, Barb, how are you, Barb? I mean, that's not what usually happens with candidates and public officials. So I scrapped the shoot and I said, we're just going to follow you around tomorrow. And we ended up with a spot where, I won't do the whole thing, but there's one point at which a woman comes up to her, older woman, and says, jeepers, dear, you've lost weight. And Mikulski says, I'm counting my calories, counting my blessings, and counting my votes. Well, you can't buy that. I mean, it's authentic and it's real. And I think Fetterman has made that kind of cultural connection. I actually also believe that Ryan may do that in Ohio. I mean, there's a poll there today that says he's ahead now by 6 points. Look, there are a lot of different polls, so I'm not telling you to believe any one individual poll. But in a state where Democrats have had a very, very tough time, Tim Ryan seems to have the capacity to convince voters that he does care about them, that he's really on their side. If I had to estimate right now, I would think Democrats have a 65 to 70% chance of holding the Senate, or even increasing their numbers in the Senate, and about a 30 to 35% chance of holding the House, in part because of the effects of redistricting. I mean, you've got states where Democrats could, Ohio's a classic example. Democrats, if they, this won't happen, but if they won the popular vote for Congress, they would probably lose the seats, the Ohio seats, 2-1. And if they only lost by 10 points, they'd probably lose the Ohio seats 3 or 4-1. So it's tough in the House, but I don't rule it out because of several things we haven't talked about. One is related to President Biden's speech, the increasing news about Donald Trump's potential legal and criminal liabilities, which I think are actually having an impact on people. People are now saying, by the way, the future of democracy is the most important issue, even ahead of the economy. Secondly, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. You know, Republicans have been running on this for years, using it to mobilize their base. And now they're like the dog that caught the car. They don't know what to do, because it turns out that almost 2/3 of the country disagrees with this decision. So you have Republican candidates and incumbents scrubbing their websites. Although Lindsey Graham today introduced a nationwide bill to restrict abortions after 15 weeks. I mean, if I were Republican candidate, I'd feel like strangling. But it doesn't matter if they clean their websites. You know, Democrats are going to put on the air what they've said. And a lot of them have said, life begins at conception, no exceptions for rape and incest, which, you know, even in conservative states, that's not necessarily what the electorate as a whole thinks. Mississippi voted a few years ago on an amendment that says life begins at conception and rejected it. So there are these big moving factors out there that have changed what looked like a gloomy outlook for Democrats to a situation where we're certainly not going to have a blue tide, but we might have a blue ripple instead of a red wave.
Let me turn very quickly to a couple of questions from folks who are listening in. Yes, one of the questions, sort of harkening back to what you said about Vice President Gore and, you know, accepting the decision of the Supreme Court. I guess the question is, has there ever been an occasion where you thought actually a candidate who appeared to be losing shouldn't concede, and gave that advice?
No,
you know, I think
no.
Okay.
No. And I thought Gore won, and I thought he should concede. And we had a conversation in the middle of the night on the phone after the Supreme Court decision came out, and he went and did the right thing for the country. And then kind of essentially left politics and became a prophet, and turns out to be even more right about climate change than people thought he was, and far more right than his critics assumed when An Inconvenient Truth came out. We're all living with the fact that we haven't done much up to this point about what he was warning us about.
One of the other questions from the audience is really about sort of the media, right? And the role of the media around democracy. And I guess the specific question is, you know, what to do about Fox News?
Well, under the First Amendment, I'm not clear what we could do about Fox News. You could reinstate the fairness doctrine, which the Reagan administration got rid of, which said you had to give equal hearing to both sides. But even then, you know, you'd send a Democrat on to Tucker Carlson, it might not go so well. But Fox News is not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is that the media landscape has changed profoundly. In the 1960s, we had gatekeepers. ABC, ABC to some extent, but CBS and NBC for sure, the New York Times, then the Washington Post, then the LA Times. And if you didn't get through those gates, you didn't get that quote unquote news out there. So if a young reporter had gone to Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News and kind of America's uncle, and said, Mr. Cronkite, there's a group called the John Birch Society, and they're holding a press conference today in New York, and they're going to say that President Kennedy and President Eisenhower are unwitting agents of the communist conspiracy. How many cameras do you want me to send? Cronkite would have looked up and said, you're fired. Today, that news and news like it would get on the air. I mean, if you think, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said everybody's the great senator from New York. Everybody's entitled to their own opinions. Nobody's entitled to their own facts. Today, everybody can get their own facts because you can go, this thing is a symbol of what's happened to us. In some ways, it democratizes politics because it democratizes fundraising. But it also means that we don't have gatekeepers. We don't have a common information base. You can go to whatever outlet you agree with. You can get your opinion reinforced. The half of the people in Tennessee who believe that the 2020 election was stolen can be told that over and over and over again on the websites and the cable news outlets they go to. So that's the problem that we're in, and it's not just us; it's the whole Western world. I mean, if you look and South America, if you look at Brazil right now, there's someone I consider an appalling demagogue, Jair Bolsonaro, who's also burning down the Amazon as fast as he can, who's running for re-election, is running way behind one of his predecessors, Lula da Silva, and he is obviously going to say, if he loses the election, that it was stolen, and he's going to try and stay in power. So we are living in a world that came upon us very suddenly, that people never thought a lot about what the broader implications of it were. You know, Facebook started as a way for college students to connect with each other. I mean, that was its initial idea, inspired by a thing at Harvard called the Facebook, which had pictures of all the students and information about them. So I don't have an easy answer to it. I think you got to fight back. You got to be willing to give speeches like Biden gave. You got to appeal to people's better instincts, and you have to respond. You know, you're not going to make the racists and the anti-Semites happy, but you have to respond to the insecurities of folks who feel they've been left out and left behind.
That is a difficult but important way to close this conversation, Bob. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank you everyone who is able to join us for the conversation on democracy. You know, I think this was both timely and important for those of us who care about democracy in Tennessee and around the country. Our next conversation on democracy will actually be live and in person at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga on October 3rd. We'll be hosting Andrea Bernstein, NPR reporter, producer of Trump Inc., a podcast about the former president's business interests, very much in the news still again. And Andrea also recently did a podcast called Will Be Wild that really focused on January 6th. And by October 3rd, I expect we'll probably have heard a little bit more from the House Select Committee on January 6th. Andrea also wrote a book called American Oligarchs about the Trump and Kushner families. So
David, she covered New York for years and years. She really knows this stuff.
Andrea is an old friend, and she won't talk about it, but early in her career, she actually was on the government side as a press secretary. So we'll have Andrea on October 3rd in Chattanooga. October 21st, we'll have Salon Givargesi again talking about some of the topics that Bob and I mentioned this evening around sort of the economic role in rebuilding faith in democracy. Salon is grew up in Chattanooga, is a national expert on poverty and equity. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Bob Shrum. I can't thank you enough again. Folks, have a good evening.
Okay, thanks.